Oh, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Yes,
it's good to hear your voice.
Hi, Ainsa. Hi, Kathleen.
Everyone. Apologies, I don't know. I've had to reboot this and start again. I don't know what was going on, but anyway, I'm here now.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you for
Hello
joining.
there. Hello, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to get it to load onto Facebook, but it's
It is live now, no?
it is live, but I don't think it's recording yet. I can't see a picture anyway. I'll close it. So I'm just waiting for Mesa. So I just wanted to welcome everybody to this EYSIER SIG meeting on the 8th of June. Essentially, this also coincides with a launch that I'm doing for the Empowering Young Societal Innovators for Equity and Renewal with Professional Educators and Administrators Committees for Empowerment, and that is EYSIER with Peace. And the idea is that we present a course that I developed with the book Education Policy as a roadmap for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that has been developed with an international team over many years. But when we sought funding, we really needed a handbook to present to the funders so that they really understood what we were trying to do, because although in many ways it's very simple, in some ways it's a change in epistemologies and in paradigms. So it does take some thinking about. And so we really wanted to work with African partners because my deep concern at the moment in Africa in the COVID-19 recovery is the work that the African Union are doing to silence the guns. And of course, we saw the tragedy of the migrants coming onto Spanish shores from Africa and exhausted, and of course being returned, which is going to have massive impact on how they are susceptible to the groups of people who welcome them to join them, and the implications that will have on silencing the guns and understanding violence, uncertainty, chaos and ambiguity in Africa, and empowering women who had achieved so much. And then in the lockdown, when they were closed off, isolated back in their homes, how we can make the progress again in diverse communities for community cohesion. So the course focuses on doing this, but of course it's at a time when budgets are now being redirected towards the COVID-19 vaccination, the medical emergency and immediate response. So I have put out on Crowdfund, and I'll put a link in Facebook, to raise some money so that we can do some iterations of the course with our African colleagues. And the key view is to empower them to be the trainers of the course, so that I give them the course. It's a massive online open access course anyway. They don't need me, they can just do the course. But what I want to do is, having worked with a lot of colleagues in Africa, examining PhDs, looking at teacher training systems, education systems, reading the literature from Africa, I see time and time again that post-segregation, post the Ubuntu law that separated Black and white people, was this: we have a problem, we need to improve education. And these are what the papers keep saying, but there are never really any solutions to how to do that with overcrowded classrooms and with an approach that, how do we personalize learning when we are delivering curriculums that PISA may be saying is very useful. But what I think I talk about in this talk is that PISA is not correlated to optimizing gross domestic product per capita. It doesn't equate to economic wealth. It doesn't equate to happiness. It's random scores in English, maths and science or home language that doesn't necessarily connect a Black African person to the kinds of knowledge, skills, experiences and competencies they need to be the signatories at tables for peace agreements, for silencing the guns, for empowering their children and their young people to be the future leaders for peace, for social and economic equity, and of course, for prosperity for all, to achieve what I think aligns perfectly with the Sustainable Development Goals that every country has signed up to. So I think the purpose of this talk today is to really help people understand why I'm trying to do this course and why I am empowering our African colleagues with the course, and that the idea is that I support them through it, but really act as a conduit for saying, you need to bring your culturally relevant experience to this, but these are the tools that they're using in Eton. And in my current book that I hope to get published by the end of this month, is really saying, well, you know, Eton is now saying we're at the forefront of education initiatives, innovation, and we're personalizing learning at a time that the English government is saying we want behavior hubs, we want to optimize behavior. And I'm seeing a link between this and what I'm reading in the papers and the literature in Africa about optimizing behavior, rather than optimizing the competencies of learning, of emotional intelligence, of spiritual awareness, and connecting the whole self with becoming a whole person and what it is to be human, the aesthetic and the functional, in a kind of a catch-up situation where after colonialism, people in Africa who are Black have been left in a you know, trying to catch up from segregation, from being told you're not part of this economy, to saying, well, now we're going to claim our human rights, and we are. But it seems that, for example, in South Africa, there is a call for more and more people to become leaders in financial institutions, to regulate the accounts, to regulate the financial understandings of the companies, and to regulate their loan systems and how people can propel entrepreneurial economies. But at the same time, they are saying, well, we've failed 57% of people who are chartered accountants or trying to be chartered accountants in the entrance exam. And so, excuse me, my dog's barking. Toby, come on. Toby, 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 can you help me? Come on, love. So sorry about that. So working from home. So essentially, good boy, go on, off you go. Go on. So essentially, what we're finding, and now the cat comes, what we're finding is that on the one hand, they're saying, well, we need the tools to empower people to become chartered accountants and to have diverse representation in the chartered accountancy profession, so that the legal documents, the financial accounts, are regulated and transparent in the way that they are doing business. But on the other hand, the people coming up through the Black African community schools are not achieving the kinds of competencies and the exam results get into the chartered accountancy courses, and if they do, it appears that they're failing. So I think what we're seeing is a need for the tools to understand how to optimize learning, and a different approach to learning in terms of a relational approach, in terms of what I'm presenting as, and that I've written with Daniela Canfrota, who's here today on our panel, and Mesa Haydar Baldwin, who's here on our panel, in terms of a blueprint for character development for evolution. And what I found really exciting is what Daniela brought to that paper was the idea that classics give us an ideal opportunity to alienate ourselves from some of the complexities of the politics and the diasporas that are impacting our world today, and help us to explore those very, but from a lens of thousands of years ago and using the myths to help us explore some key principles that emerge time and time again about the psychologies, the ethics, and the philosophies of human beings in their intentions and in their acts. And so I appreciate that Daniela speaks about 6 languages, including Latin, and it is that expertise that she brings to the table that is just quite remarkable in terms of understanding also the classics and the myths to really help us understand these stories. And I think it's very sad that those stories are not on the curriculum, and what it is in terms of utopia. What does that mean? And you know, as Brown said, if a man's reach should outstretch his grasp, or what is a heaven for? And you know, I've been reading quite a lot of the people who, for example, President Roosevelt, who led out of crises, which of course I think the world is in at the moment. And it is about ideals, and it is about striving, and it is about people, you know, explaining and defining if we are told we should not attain or try to attain eradicating poverty and empowering everyone to live a good life and have a threshold of quality of life that education, social and economic policy facilitates, then they need to explain why it's okay to live in a world where people are suffering at such high levels when other people, you know, are becoming multi-billionaires over the same period. So I think these are some serious questions that if we just keep doing English, maths and science in our PISA quest to be #1 on the league tables, we're missing a really important issue in terms of over thousands of years we've had war and about 250 years of peace. And so now I think is the time for our communities to come together and say, well, how can we achieve peace together? Because if we don't, we won't have a planet left, because we're going to be fighting over resources and over the ways in which we prioritize and order those goods and the means of their production. And it's exploitative currently, which I personally don't think for anyone of faith or no faith, when we think about what it is to be human is actually tenable. So having explained why the course on alisontason.com is so important, and the full open access online course is available for anybody to go through as they wish, it's a master's level course. I just want to talk a little bit about what this course really tries to do. And it's about building trust. It's about communication. It's about understanding boundaries and understanding what respect is, and that's essential to create and maintain good relationships with others. And that's really important for MESA's framework in terms of developing collaborative thinking that Daniela Cantrota and myself and Maya Menalte used to read Italian, Iraqi, English, and MESA used it to read Lebanese education policy through, to understand the extent to which students are encouraged to ask questions, to be critical, to be collaborative in problem solving, and to communicate those things together to build solidarity for addressing issues such as how do we achieve peace and prosperity for all and the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I was really grateful to MESA for bringing that framework to us. But understanding these issues of trust really means that the classroom will need to develop good relationships through pedagogies that are promoting what I use as Dewey's work of assessment for personal and social learning, and a broader disciplinary knowledge, so that we bring the disciplines that are so important, English, maths, science, and so on, but that we use a pedagogical approach of inquiry, which is something that Dewey has brought to the table, something that, you know, over thousands of years, different key philosophers, psychologists, sociologists have helped us to understand in terms of this disciplinary knowledge. Now, how do we apply it, and how do we internalize, compare and contrast it with our own understandings of the world, so that that knowledge becomes usable It becomes knowledge that is for human evolution, rather than knowledge you've got to learn to jump through a hoop, pass this test, and then we might give you a job where you're never going to use it again. And I think these are some of the real issues about connecting with our economies that are embedded in our cultural heritages that are diverse, but that give us the opportunity to come together and to understand each other and to actually enjoy that, to enjoy finding out about each other's differences and celebrating that, because there's a lot of good things in a lot of different ways of being and doing. So it's about developing the knowledge, skill through tried and tested methods, and how you can apply those in new contexts to meet the demands of the future labour market. And this is some of the issues when employer engagement starts to determine the curriculum and the pedagogies, because what they're asking is for people to learn at the age of 6, 7, 8, up to 14, for skills or competencies that the employers need now. And these people are going to be engaging with the labour market in 10 years' time, when the competencies will be very different. So what Mesa and Daniela and myself have done with Maya Minalte is looked at the European framework for qualifications and mapped the competencies to this idea of learning how to learn, of leading your own learning, so that you can then develop your own in a lifelong learning approach that I've learned so much about from Michaela Rasituru and Arto Kalioniemi, the professor at Helsinki University, in terms of how are we going to use these competencies to develop a way in which we can prepare people for jobs that we don't know and that don't currently exist. So we need to be cautious, and of course we absolutely need partnerships with employer engagement, but cautious with how we develop a curriculum and pedagogies for the whole person and really be human. And maybe strategic plans in education systems need to define the aesthetic and the functional and what it is to be human and the purpose of education before we start thinking about behaviour hubs. Because education is not about controlling behaviour, because I suggest in the book that I'm about to publish, and many others have said this, as I'm going to reference them. I'm not pretending this is something I've come up with myself. And I've learned a lot from Professor Jim Conroy, Professor Bob Davis, Glasgow University's leaders in these kinds of ideas, in terms of, you know, how does this really propel popularism? And you know, how does popularism prevent the people from mobilizing their education to become fully civically participatory in the social contract that they are going to be living in? So education is imperative to empower equity and renewal, and in terms of equity for class, for gender, for race, for special educational needs and disability, and in fact all characteristics of the UK 2010 Equality Act and the European Union legislation, in terms of how are we going to ensure that our people are transcending from an education system that colonizes the mind to being able to enable people to talk back, which is what the research is finding is what happens in private schools that are elite, that are pipelines into the elite universities. And how are we going to get proportional representation of people from all the stratification of class in the communities into institutions and into higher education? As of we have authentic advocates for narrowing the achievement gaps based on poverty that are driven through class, race, and gender. And I think that this is really important in terms of how we develop entrepreneurial and creative economies that can drive exciting and refreshing regimes of social inclusion that improve equity, and they transform a legacy of colonial distribution of economies that distribute a nation's birthright from Africa, from Pakistan, from India, from Trinidad and Tobago, from the West Indies, to cash-rich European Western economies. And we still have to grapple with that. We still have to grapple. Although class is a massive issue, we have a massive issue with supremacy. And we do need to think about how we are helping people be disabused of their unconscious bias, because, you know, we owe that to them, to understand the ways in which our billionaires, corporations and banks, through financialization, to have gone supranational. And that really does change economic and social policy and the kind of power that politicians have in terms of making a difference and serving the people who are voting for them, when they need to keep on board these supranational agents who are, you know, with financialization, able to have a lot of power in the kind of decision making. So that's why I think it's so important for us to understand groundwork cases and how that shapes our faculty of judgment, and how we can look at that if it's difficult to look at it in today's context. And of course, the complexities and the pain of today's with COVID-19 is enormous. To look at it through, as Daniela Canfrota presents for us, the classics, and thinking about these stories that help us understand what it is to be human and how we can learn from the past to improve how we live together for peace and prosperity in the future. So the hallmark of empowering curriculum frameworks with opportunity for talkback and asking questions exists with flatter pedagogical relationships that my dear colleague, Professor Khalid Arar from Palestine, that is now teaching in America, and I wrote together about. So flatter pedagogical relationships are already found in elite private schools, coupled with a more generous and relaxed approach to discipline. And this results in more equal relationships and provides a space for students to practice their interactions with those in authority without fear of repercussions, and provides opportunities for them to learn how to effectively apply pressure on those with power to secure advantages for themselves, both at school and at university. And that comes from Hector MacArthur, Savage and Friedman 2020, and I quote from their page 21. So private schools are keen to keep these pedagogical successes as a key selling point for attracting students' parents to pay high school fees to assure their child's smooth transition to elite power. And I get that from Baradell 2020. So social mobility and its enemies call education's dark side as an ever-escalating educational arms race. And entry to the most sought-after universities is dominated by private schools and a narrow group of state schools. And these gaps of poverty and achievement based on class, race, gender, send, all the protected characteristics of the Equality Act are getting wider. And we have a lot of universities that produce incredible research, powerful research with strategies that are just not being adopted because governments, through populism, are encouraging people to vote for them on ideologies. And people are trusting ideologies without understanding the impact of those ideologies because they're not being taught about the impact of the ideologies in schools. And understanding about different forms of knowledge, empirical knowledge, that's observational, scientific, you can find proof of concept by repeating the experiments, the methodologies. That's an important point. Logical knowledge, how do things make sense sequentially? And if there is a sequence of moving forward in a logical process, step by step, then presumably you could take that logic and regressively go back, abstraction, to the source. So as we go forward, we could go back and we could understand at which points of that system, imagine hazard analysis of control points, where things go wrong and why. What decisions are made, what decisions have been made when things go wrong, and it causes war. So my concern is behaviourist learning in the state classroom was identified in 23 nation states critical education policy analyses that I was privileged enough to be principal investigator for. And it was really empowered by Professor Mohammed Iqbal from Pakistan University and Professor Victoria Pogosian and Professor Sergei Trapitsyn from Herzen State Pedagogical University of Russia. And they encouraged me to do this work. And then, of course, Professor Pierre Serperioni was just an incredible encourager, and Professor Helen Gunter, Professor Richard Pring. These people really encouraged me to say, why don't you go from the Second World War? And my concern is many people don't understand that Plowden's report and the 1960s was very much about personalized learning. So whilst I'm 53 and I went through that kind of education system at that time, a lot of our new colleagues, amazing professionals, don't necessarily know about that history. They don't necessarily know about the Black Papers and Ruskin's speech, and how we shifted to English, maths and science, propelled from our analyses by a shift in the power of who owned the oil and who got the revenues from the oil. And so blaming teachers for reduction in GDP per capita and economic catastrophe, crises, just really was inappropriate and wrong. But it's what we did to defend narrowing the curriculum and moving away from personalized learning, which, remember, is advocated by Eton. So this behaviorist culture prevents building relationships of unconditional positive regard in the classroom and between school communities and the elected statespeople and their independent regulators of legislation. So the policymakers are remote from the children in the classroom when adopting an economical neoliberalist approach driven through by behaviorism. Educational psychologist services were cut by the Conservative Party as critical thinking was cut from curriculums that our paper, Daniela Canfrota, Maya Minalte, and Mesa Hayder Baldwin and I developed with Mesa's framework competencies for critical thinking. And we identified that this correlated with growth in demand for mental health and emotional support in schools. So the removal of personalized learning followed by the removal of educational psychologists to support people through the kind of education pedagogies that may not have this kind of Plowden approach was really removing them from the classroom. And now teachers are being asked to think about the 4 tiers of mental health. And this isn't what teachers are trained to do. And educational psychologists are spending a lot of time preparing education healthcare plans. And the strategy is a good one, but it's moving people who are key workers in schools, supporting teachers at a time when children are returning and need emotional, mental support after what they've gone through with this crisis with COVID-19. And they're being replaced by behaviour hubs, which is not, I don't think, allowing children the time they need to heal and the time they need to reconnect their relationships with themselves and others and build psychologies, philosophies and ethics of trust, which I go into more detail with in my forthcoming book. But at the moment, and of course in the course that I'm offering with the crowdfunding that I'll put the link into the Facebook and the EYSIER SIG website, but essentially I've been eligible for research excellence frameworks in universities for 21 years now. And I note that the achievement gaps based on race, gender, poverty and class have been getting progressively wider over this period. And I find this outcome disappointing since my own research and many of my colleagues' research is firmly focused on narrowing achievement gaps, but they're disappearing from the universities. And that narrative, that understanding is also disappearing. And it's coming at a time when we are having more and more for-profit private universities. And as we've seen in the US, many of them charged enormous fees, collected the fees, paid the profits to shareholders, and then went bankrupt and left students having paid fees with no chance of graduating. And I think that this is really concerning, because not only is that an issue, there's also an issue of who are regulating the threshold levels of the kind of competences people are gaining in private universities, and how they align to the quality and the competences of the very high QAA standards, European Qualifications Framework standards. And if people want to generate income from for-profit private universities, what kind of pressure do they put on people to ensure that marketing says, come to our course and you'll get the grades? You can go with your credential for an interview, but if you don't understand how to apply the knowledge, skills and experiences that your credential suggests you have, how are you going to help your institution? And I think what concerns me even more is if we are being driven by people from a kind of a neoliberalist approach who want privatization. Maybe they don't want critical thinkers as key people who are leading their institutions. So I'm just concerned about the facilitators and the blockers for the impact of research mapping to clear national strategic plans that align with higher education strategic plans, narrow the achievement gaps based on poverty, and to deliver the sustainable development goals, to empower people who are discriminated against with intersectionalities of discrimination on class, race, gender, special education needs, particularly in the COVID-19 recovery. So just moving on, because I've been talking for nearly half an hour now. ABCDE is a blueprint for character development for evolution. Basically, about developing the tools required to formulate questions that hold half of the answers, and identifying intersectionalities of discrimination that are perpetuating poverty. Excuse me. And B is developing definitions that are compared and contrasted with different kinds of knowledge that has been thought and said throughout time with personal beliefs and knowledge, to develop a model of the root causes of the perpetuation of poverty based on intersectionalities of discrimination, preventing social and economic well-being. So this model is not saying this is a model of how you do things. This model is, this is really giving you the tools you need to keep asking questions and to have a moral inquiry into the ethical frameworks of the institutions that shape what you can and cannot think and do. And if people don't understand what that means, then I think our education systems are failing. Because I didn't find that out until I was in my late 30s and I got my doctorate. And one of the reasons I've done this course is because I really believe that some of the most amazing supervisors that I was privileged to learn from, Professor Peter Ribbins, Professor Helen Gunter, Professor Richard Pring, so many, Professor Ron Glass, so many people that I could have learned that at school. A lot of those key ideas I could have learned at school, and it would have empowered me to have better ways of managing and making good decisions in my own life. And I really want to see that for other people, make an informed choice to say, actually, I don't want this knowledge, but I just want them to know what they're saying no to. I want people to say no without fully understanding what they're saying no to. So C is to provide easy to use tools to enable human beings to develop methods to synthesize the models of the B, where they develop different knowledges of understanding the world that they're living in, compared and contrasted with their intrinsic knowledge, which is also their faith, if they're a person of faith or no faith, and the scriptures that they may live their lives by, or the Declaration of Human Rights if they're humanistic, or the Noble Truths if they're Buddhist, and so on. And then D is testing the synthesized models of B and C that are change strategies that have emerged from their evidence they've collected to gain proof of concept of which of the change strategies has worked for them in narrowing the achievement gaps or aligned to achieving some of the targets in the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations 2016, available on the internet. So really, these developing the change strategies with tools can be used day by day to hold accountable governance systems and agents to serve the interests of the common people in the social and economic institutions and the infrastructure that they govern in the quadruple helix. That's just all the elements of society. And hold accountable systems and agents for socializing investment, risks, and rewards in the embedded or disembedded economies of the quadruple helix that prepare and propel entrepreneurial economies and provide just relationships between the private and the public sector. And 3, to narrow and then eliminate achievement gaps based on class, race, gender, special educational needs and disability, and all the protected characteristics of the UK 2010 Equality Act, and eliminate poverty, which is the first Sustainable Development Goal, by ensuring equitable quality education, which is the 4th Sustainable Development Goal, that promotes lifelong learning opportunities for all. And finally, E, and these are the key things in the massive online open access course for empowering young societal innovators for equity and renewal, is E. It's identifying the principles, going right back to the start, to the source of where we can start to build our understandings, that how we can use ABCD, those 4 stages, so that the full process of understanding the principles of what it is we want to address, what it is we want to achieve, the principles of eliminating poverty, inclusion, searching for truth, being tolerant of opposing views, being critical, always generating new knowledge. It can be applied to other contexts to identify intersectionalities of discrimination based on the class, race, gender, and so on. And to eliminate poverty to achieve social and economic well-being, equity and justice for all that we could share in science with and for society databases that we can start to develop in schools as hubs and link them up in networks. And particularly, this is what I wanted to offer to our colleagues in the African Union, in nations, to start to work within and between and across borders for really propelling entrepreneurial economies and creating wealth and gross domestic product per capita, that through investment can create infrastructure, build greater infrastructure, which is going to eliminate, one would hope, the relationship between poverty and violence. So that is, in a nutshell, what the course is about. The assessment for personal and social learning, the Dewey tool, is important in terms of step-by-step how we apply ABCDE to particular intended learning outcomes to achieve competencies in the curriculum. And we can talk about that at another time. But really, I just wanted to say that this is really about relationships, building relationships, and having the knowledge, skills, and competencies and experiences the people who are leading our policy for social and economic well-being or not have. And I just think that everybody has a right to the kinds of knowledge that gives power. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much. Thank you for this rich explanation about the project. Thank you. And I think one of the most important aspects you have emphasized is that the project favors that every student can grow as an active citizen. Can you explain in more detail how the relationship between pupil and teacher in this project favors these, please?
Yes, of course. I think what we're doing is we're developing pedagogical relationships, and this is something that Mesa is also looking at in her PhD research, in terms of how do we empower students to say, well, this is a problem. You know, I have to meet this particular competency in my maths curriculum. And to be able to do that, I have some questions. Rather than you tell me how to do this so that I have to memorize this equation, I'm going to start asking some questions about why is this a problem? And what do I need to get? What information do I need to be able to address this problem? And so ABCDE is really A, what are the questions I need to ask about gaining this competence? B, how can I, with my teacher's support, find the kind of knowledge through research? Maybe there are iPads in the classroom, maybe there are books. A library is always wonderful in schools and colleges, further education. Lifelong learning opportunities in employer engagement through apprenticeships. How do I explore these different kinds of knowledges available to help me address my own question, but keeping that within, you know, boundaries of upper and lower control limits, so that you don't feel overwhelmed, that you can't answer it yourself, but also you're not bored because it's too easy. And I think that's where the teacher comes in, by differentiating the learning and the kinds of questions they encourage the student to ask. And if that student is saying, well, I'm not quite sure about this, rather than give them the answer, why don't you ask them more questions to help them make the links that may be missing? And then when they've made those links, they can begin to gain the competency that you needed them to get. And so really, they then need to, at C, find their own methods. And in their methods, they can begin to develop ways in which they could find different ways to answer the question. There isn't just one way of answering a question. And so through these methods, they can develop a proof of concept. Now, that proof of concept that they can test, they begin to develop confidence in themselves, self-esteem. They begin to realize that they can do. Yes, they can do. Sí se puede. And they can go on to the principles and then can apply to other disciplines that they're trying to learn, other competencies. So I think what's absolutely crucial is that when they get feedback on a process within that ABCDE, it's not just a tick, well done, and move on. The teachers mark that and everybody's happy. It's about the student looking at that feedback and making sense of it, because this is quality data from the teacher. And this then builds a pedagogical relationship. And actually giving the feedback is where the student begins to understand, I haven't quite got it there. And if you're thorough in the feedback and the student really gets it, and you don't start moving them on to the next thing until they've got that foundation, then they can then move forward and build on a solid foundation, rather than wobble through on a net that they're potentially going to fall through because there's so many gaps in their knowledge that they didn't need to have as gaps, but that different children in the classroom are going at different speeds. And this is why differentiation is so crucial. But surely we need to understand that. My own position is that I'm a Christian and believe that God says all people are equal, and I actually agree with that. And so, you know, when I see somebody doing a really important job, for example, taking the rubbish, I'm really, really grateful. And when I see somebody so disrespectful that they get up behind their wagon and nearly knock somebody over who's pulling the cart, obviously that there is a lack of understanding. And where has that developed from? You know, why isn't there the empathy there for a human being who's doing a really important job? And where is this coming from? If we're in a classroom and we say we're the good ones and you're not so good, that isn't about solidarity. And I think it's about, obviously competition is really healthy, really important, but it's also about, as a class, we respect people who may not be able to be quite as good as you know, quadrilateral equations as somebody else who may be able to run into a burning building with all the right kit, pick you up and pull you out and save your life. Because, you know, we've all got gifts, we've all got special gifts, and we really don't know that somebody who might be a carer might have a conversation with somebody one day, and it gives them the motivation to go home and keep going. And that carer had no idea they'd had that impact on that person, and that person may go on to find a cure for cancer. So we really don't know the impact of our lives in this web that is being created day by day. If you're a person of faith, by the Supreme Being, if you're a person of no faith, through our humanitarian, aesthetic and functional interactions with the world and each other. And so I think we really need to perhaps stop and think about how we work together collaboratively, and how teachers provide feedback in the classroom that is differentiated, that allows people to go at their own pace and not the pace of the curriculum that's going to get you to PISA, because it will fail on every front if we do that, and we are failing our children. And so I think that's how I think ABCDE works, because it's about personalized learning, but personalized learning that's manageable. You know, it's not an individual education plan for every competency, for every, you know, a wills that you're going to have for every day. It's about a differentiation that works within a classroom, that everybody is challenged, but in an appropriate way that's doable, and that they're not bored. Because that's when the boredom, as John Dewey talks about, miseducation comes in. That's when the behavioral problems come in. That's when people start to get bored, and that's so we're creating behavior hubs without actually going to the root cause of why are people bored in education systems. And I think that's why ABCD is so important, because I was educated within a Plowden approach, and I did enjoy personalized learning and at primary level. So I think that a very long answer to your question, but I saw the transformation going to secondary level, and that was 1979. I went into secondary, so I did see the impact of Ruskin's speech and the reading, writing and arithmetic, and it was harsh. So I do think there is a difference between behavior approach and personalized learning approaches. That's a very long answer, Daniela.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for the panel?
If not, I want to ask you, actually, you have already answered the question I will ask you, but you said that the ABCD model can be used in various contexts. Can you give us an example of how ABCD can be used to develop critical thinking, not only at school, but also at work in the everyday life?
Yes, of course. I think when we're in working, I was fortunate enough to work in industry, and I kept getting promoted, fortunately, when I was on the graduate training scheme. And the yields that we had in each of the departments increased. And I think a lot of that was to do with, I took a Japanese approach to quality circles, because it was total quality management at that time. And I'd been around the Nissan factory to see how it worked and so on. And I didn't have any funding for quality circles. So we used to go and meet in the pub and play pool and just talk about things. And the people explained to me that I was working with, and they were on the production line, what things weren't working for them, what was difficult. And so we could apply, but I didn't know I was doing it then, ABCDE, to ask the questions of how can we put this right for you? And it was very often about putting the person doing the job into a position of more leadership and the resources they need and the prioritization of the goods they needed in that production of the goods. So I think what I tried to do was, first of all, have an approach where everybody was equal, because that's what I believe. And then I think essentially trying to establish from the knowledge they gave me that they had accumulated over years of working on the line, how that addressed our questions and what methods we needed to do to make the process more comfortable for them. That was my priority, because safety is always my number one. And as it's also linked to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, although it's not empirically based, and it's a useful framework. So when at the bottom rung is people feel safe, and then, you know, moving onwards from that, we were able for people to be comfortable and to then start to say, well, this is how we can improve efficiency. This is how we can improve quality. This is how we can start to take ownership for that, rather than say, oh, great, that I'm going to get 3 hours in the cafeteria because no production breakdown. They shifted to a more, well, we're responsible for this process, so we're going to make it work. And if it's going to be wrong, we're going to tweak stuff, and so we don't have a breakdown. So I think the proof of the concept was when the yield started to go up, and of course that's more money, more profit, and then you have principles that you can take. And I moved to other departments, rendering plant and effluent plants, managing those, and there's just some principles that you can apply. And I think that it's using those research approaches, and I've seen that certainly in other spheres of consultants going in. And I think you very often find is companies will pay a consultant a great amount of money to go and ask the people doing the job for the answers, and then they come and present it to the board, and then they'll put in the change strategy, but all the knowledge was already in that organization. It's just sometimes organizations, they have a challenging ways in which they can build relationships between the people on the line and the management. I don't know whether there's some fear about building a relationship there, or whether I don't know, but essentially they need to get an outside consultant to come and ask the people how to fix things, and then pay them a lot of money to fix it, when actually everybody had their own answers all along. It's just they're not communicating or collaborating or working in solidarity, because that might empower people, develop flatter pedagogical relationships between senior management and the people working, which might actually flip the system, change the way in which people share the rewards. We talked about socializing risk, investment, and rewards. I think obviously entrepreneurs have always, got to be rewarded for taking the risk because it's their houses on the line. But I do think at the same time that you get more from people, as the goal says, in terms of bottlenecks of factories, process lines, has analysis of critical control points. You get more if you can do research applying something like ABCDE to eradicate those, to optimize efficiency. And actually total quality management really gives you a framework for that, but it also says people are your most important asset, and safety first. And I think where I sometimes have some tensions is when people want to meet an order or want to meet a deadline, and they forget about those key principles, values of doing the right thing rather than doing things right.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for this talk. Thank you, Daniela, for these thought-provoking questions. And nice to see you, Kathleen, again. When you speak about, Alison, when you speak about social mobility, what do you think are the biggest barriers to social mobility and how it can be improved, and who are the people responsible for improving it? Sorry, these are 3 questions together, but they're quite linked. It's like, so the first part of the question is, what are the biggest barriers to social mobility? And how can it be improved, and who is responsible to improve it?
I think when we look at someone like Buchanan, who said that everybody wants to be the master and control other people's responses and behavior so that they can be the master. And that is a kind of a neoliberalist approach that sees people rapidly deregulating systems to allow them to optimize their own interests. And that ceases to be regulated because the people who are the regulators have an investment in those people also being successful. I think social mobility is therefore being challenged by a regime or ideology that actually prevents people from understanding that very kind of way of developing an economic system. So what I say in the book Education Policy as a Roadmap for Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in chapter 6 is that I think, and I mentioned in the previous ISIER SIG, if we keep outsourcing to optimize profits and the dividends to the shareholders, we end up moving the production to a country that isn't cash rich, and so that they can be paid much less money. But of course, what that does is it stops the people paid in the cash rich country, and without an income, they can't buy the product that company is producing. And then the new country that is being paid money is trying to develop gross domestic product per capita to create wealth. So they're not going to be in a position to buy this product either. They're just wanting to get money to build their economy. So the actual company that is outsourcing ends up being unsustainable and becoming, bankrupt, ending. And we see this time and time again. And that is a problem for social mobility, because if we're dependent on a labour market that is working on flawed rules, you can't regulate and then say it's a free-for-all, kind of really Wild West show. And then at the same time say, well, actually, we're going to start mercantile law, and we're going to start saying, well, we're going to charge you for buying and selling your products. So you've got a system that's saying we want to deregulate, but now that that's losing money for us, we want to regulate again. And it's what I think Lincoln said in terms of a house divided against itself cannot stand. So if people can't join a labour market without being on 0-hour contracts and having 3 jobs, never knowing from day to day if they're going to get work, never knowing if they do get work, when they'll get paid, they can't pay a mortgage, they can't pay rent. They end up going to food banks. That's unsustainable. How can an economy build on making people so in poverty they have to go to food banks? And how do people in education see that the education they're getting in these behaviourist hubs is going to translate into them getting a job in the labour market beyond 0-hour contracts? They won't be able to have a home, they won't be able to have a family, and they won't be able to pay into a pension pot. So it's unsustainable. So unless we start looking at how we can invest in people so that education maps to the competencies they need to maybe rethink and propel entrepreneurial economies. For example, Finland, as I've said before, has a much higher, about 12% points higher than England in terms of small and medium enterprises. And this is something the European Union really promotes. And when I've worked in Brussels or the European countries, and in England when we were still in the European Union, so much money was invested in infrastructure, which is of course what presidents have done. The Roosevelt, President Barack Obama, out of the crisis, invest in infrastructure, invest in construction, invest in building. I would walk around cities and just see so much investment in infrastructure and construction, and in Birmingham with EU funding, and the kinds of returns on investment you got from paying into being in the EU in terms of a building infrastructure that would empower local small and medium economies is really important. But if you are promoting large corporations that don't necessarily pay tax but pay a lot of dividends, and maybe are promoting or propelling 0-hour contracts and not necessarily promoting an empathy with the workforces because they're disembedded from them. You know, people will invest and buy and sell on the stock market without ever knowing anybody who works for the companies that they're investing in, and they just want to get a profit. It's just a game of numbers to them. They don't see the human beings' lives behind that. And I think that kind of disconnection between the immaterial, the souls of our human beings on this planet, is unsustainable. And it will lead to violence, uncertainty, chaos and ambiguity, as we're seeing on the beaches in Spain, as we're seeing on all the beaches, of people being washed up from, trying to escape the VUCA that's being created by war in other areas, and the violence that you and I have documented in Lebanon, for example, Mesa, and that I've documented in Iraq with Maya Minalte, and the complexities of, going back to Egypt and the Suez Canal and all these sorts of issues of Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. And, where did it all start? And, if we're going to think about colonialism, what about the Romans? What kind of strategies did they use? What kind of strategies did Julius Caesar use? We talk about Machiavellian. I mean, the intelligence, but without the ethics, without the aesthetics. And then you think about the Greeks, the colonialism there. There've been so many episodes of colonialism in our global history that we can learn from, but that we don't appear to. So I think for social mobility, it's about really thinking about what are sustainable economies? How can we balance between the private and the public? How can we balance between corporations and small and medium enterprises that are allowed to have genuine competition and are allowed to survive and thrive without secret cartels, monopolies, and contracts that are who you know and how much you pay? And it's just a level of, I think, opportunity now to build trust in terms of philosophies, psychologies, and ethics within a reasonable and methodological security and defense underpinning any ways forward, so that we can propel peace and prosperity and economic prosperity to eradicate poverty. Because if we don't eradicate poverty, and we don't allow social mobility, and we don't allow people to be able to enter the workforce beyond a 0-hour contract, so that they can start to build their own local economies around, well, we're going to grow our own food, which is going to be sold to the local cafes, which might do better business than McDonald's. Okay, a few McDonald's might close in some villages where there are some local cafes who get the millions of pounds that was going to McDonald's, and that pays for the farmers who don't sell to Tesco's anymore when they say, well, we'll sell you all our strawberries, and then they get to the door and Tesco says, oh well, we're doing buy one get one free now, bog off, buy one get one free, and if you don't take that, then you can take the whole lot away and it'll all go to rot, because of course that's just not sustainable, and the farmers will go out of business. So we've got to look after our farmers, because you know, by 2050 there's evidence we won't have enough food to feed the world, but there's so much poverty and starvation in the world. Do we do that now anyway? But I really think the important thing about social mobility is how we build social and economic policy at a global international level that is translated at national level, with bridges, agents who understand the difference between the international general understandings of policy, the national level, and then our district people, our bridges between the national offer of education, social and economic policy, and the district local level in schools, colleges, and how that connects to local labour markets, to empower people to have the competencies for social mobility, not necessarily geographical, because that can break networks, it can leave people isolated and vulnerable, but in terms of them choosing to have access to middle class pathways through maybe small and medium enterprises that is supported by the kind of creation of wealth through construction, through investment, and through an element of military, but also an element of creating the entrepreneurial opportunities that I've talked about, that is grassroots up from, you know, because when you've got the food cafes, once you've got those societies, communities coming up, they're going to need services, they're going to need electricians, engineers, they're going to need doctors, and so you begin to build a community. So for example, when I was in Chicago, South Side, maybe you see a lot of concrete, and the people's local food shop is you know, selling cans of food. There's a wonderful opportunity there to start to grow and develop local farms or orchards or local opportunities to then build communities and through that kind of development, building infrastructures, which of course, you know, I was privileged to listen to colleagues in Glasgow talk about, you know, that they're served maybe the communities by 3 bookies. That's where you go to place bets to lose all your money. And basically, doctors is 20 minutes away. So I'm seeing, you know, in very different parts of the world, a similar principle that we could apply ABCDE to empower people to have the confidence to have said, well, when I was 13, my teacher helped me understand how to solve this problem myself. And now I know how to solve this problem myself as an adult. And I'm going to keep building on that and building on that. I'm going to keep using ABCDE or a tool like it to develop change strategies with proof of concept. And I'm going to be realistic about it. And it's going to enable me to maybe move out of being in 0-hour contracts and then end up being homeless or going to a food bank, and I'm going to be able to provide for my own family. So I've just had a really good message from Kathleen to everybody, the business gateway model. So maybe this would be a good opportunity to talk to Kathleen.
Thanks, Alison. It was just something that came into my head while you were talking earlier about SMEs, and this is not in my area of experience when working in local government. It's principally because the team that led this worked in the same organisation as I did at the time, and the support for SMEs in Scotland had principally been done through the main economic development agency, Scottish Enterprise. But after a review of that organisation, which some years ago, they gave up that role, and this was taken over by local government, and as I say, the model was called Business Gateway, and each of the 32 local authorities in Scotland have their own Business Gateway team, and there is the central unit, as I've explained, that acts as a liaison with central government and with Scottish enterprise. But what they try to do, and they try to do it in a number of different ways, is to support startups, people who are interested in starting some sort of business, and help them. And I've mentioned just one example of how they support them through securing premises to assist. In fact, it was quite funny when my daughter was getting married and I was looking for my hat for the wedding. I went to a small business who literally works from her own home. You walk into her home and it is just filled with hats that she's made. And she makes these, I really don't know how she did it, but she was a lovely woman and very welcoming. And the fact that this was her home, I've no idea where she stayed, where there was room for her to stay in this house while she was making these hats. But her problem had been, she was growing so much as a business that she was outgrowing her own home as a base for her business. But she was having difficulty in securing another premises. And I put her in touch with Business Gateway just because these people worked in the same office as I did, and said, look, is there someone who can help her? Now, as it happened, she'd seen somewhere it been secured by someone else. She missed that opportunity. And as far as I know, she's still working from her home, but she knows who to speak to now. And she knows that if she wants to move on to something else, then she has an option to speak to them in terms of getting assistance in securing, better premises for the work that she's doing. That's just one example. There was something else that came into my mind when you were talking earlier about the difficulty about educational psychologists. That problem existed in Scotland as well, and it may well still do. There was at one time a bursary which was given to students who were wishing to become educational psychologists. That bursary was cancelled by the government at the time, and I'm talking about the Scottish government here. And it was only because of the real pressure that 32 local authorities were having in securing educational psychologists that eventually it was a complex method of finding new funding to put people through courses again that came about, and it was quite complex, and not every authority was keen to get involved in it, because the money was having to come from the local authorities' purse as opposed to Scottish government. But they've tried to regain ground on that, and but it's still a pressured area, particularly given the difficulties that some young people find themselves in because of societal pressures, poverty, range of different problems. And I would imagine that the impact of COVID and the pandemic will end up amplifying that particular issue. And I think there will be even more pressure on those educational psychologists to try and support young people in Scotland in terms of how they are move forward beyond the pandemic. Although, having said that, it was interesting. I was out at the weekend with my husband, went for a walk down to the coast, and we came across a queue of people. Now, these would be in their 30s, and these people were waiting to go to a drop-in centre for their COVID vaccinations. The queue must have been, I reckon, about, I don't know, half a mile, 3/4 of a mile long. When we were there, we arrived about 10:15, 10 o'clock in the morning, and the queue was right along the promenade and was going into a municipal building. And they were all coming out with their bits of paper saying they had their vaccinations. But it was quite heartening to see that these were, you know, in that age group who were determined not to wait for their appointment, but wanted to actually be active in securing that vaccination, you know, to ensure that, you know, that we'd start to see some impact and see a reduction in the impact of this virus. Probably a couple of other things I was going to say, but I've now forgotten them. I should have written them down at the time, but it's been an interesting chat we've been having, so it's good.
Kathleen, thank you so much for your input. I think that's absolutely vital, and that's why, you know, the journal Groundwork Cases and Faculty of Judgment is started to try and develop these kinds of cases so that other people can learn from them. I mean, from what's happened with Business Gateway, and then what's happened with Scottish funding of educational psychologists, if we can understand that and understand the principles at play, there are many authorities in all over the world that are experiencing the same kind of things. And if we can look at it in terms of keywords in abstracts, that's the point of it. That's, you know, why higher education has developed this amazing peer review system. It enables people to access it through data hubs that are science with and for society. So I just thank you. It's a really important contribution.
There was one other thing, and I've just been reminded of it myself, and it was going right back to the beginning when you mentioned PISA. I'm pretty certain that this is still the case, but Scottish Government withdrew from the PISA arrangements because they wanted to measure themselves against themselves. And it doesn't strike me as the most sensible thing in the world to have done. And I think there was a lot of concern among a range of education policymakers out with Scottish Government who thought this was not necessarily the best idea. And instead, what's happening now is effectively benchmarking among the 32 local authorities who run the education services in Scotland. And I suppose the axe that was being held over local government's head was that education would be taken out of local government control if progress on attainment wasn't being made. And I think that it took a lot of work on the part of my former organisation and the ADES, the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, to stop that happening, because there was seen to be some reason, or for whatever reason, there was a thought that the 32 couldn't work together in order to move attainment on. Now, I do follow what's been happening since then, and I know that dependent on who it is that you speak to, people will say, oh, well, attainment isn't progressing, whereas others will say, oh yes, it is working here and it is working there, but the totality of it might not be as far on as we would hope. But in terms again of the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, I think it would be very difficult for any administration to criticise progress and attainment because of the situation of the virus and the impact that it's had on learning for our children and young people over the last year and a half. And I think potentially going forward in the next year or so, to recover from that is going to take some time in order to take place. And as I've said before, my interest in this particular group was to find out more in relation to how my granddaughter will make progress in her first years of life. And I'm still seeing difficulties for her. I mean, she's progressing well in and of herself, but because of the difficulty of the structures that have been put in place, the guidance that have been put in place, we're still missing a trick in supporting those very young children who need to have that contact, not just with adults, but with other children of their own age, in order to start or to improve their development. And at the moment, we're being offered in Scotland a vaccine certificate, but the only reason and that's to prove that we've had our vaccinations, our 2 vaccinations. But it's only being issued if you're traveling. If you want something, if you want a document to prove that you've had those vaccinations, if you want to travel, whether it's within the UK or further afield. But I think there's a trick being missed, because we could use that for so many other things. We could start to run events and start to run groups for young children like my granddaughter, with people who can prove that they've had their vaccinations. And we could start doing these things far sooner and get the groundwork done for those children before they start school, so that we're not finding ourselves with a generation of children who are potentially going to be hampered by the very things that they should be experiencing without really thinking about it, and not giving the opportunity for family to ensure that they can get to experience that. I'm probably not, what's it, the word, there's a term for this, preaching to the choir. I think that's the one I'm thinking about, but it's something I feel quite strongly about, and I feel that we're not, as a society, making more of a fuss about that. Why we're not asking the question, why are we not doing more for this particular group of children to support them? Because in 5 years' time, when they start school, or whenever they do start school, will they be able to cope with those pressures that will inevitably come on them? Are we going to be able to do that and be sure that they're going to have the same opportunities moving forward through the rest of their school careers and their careers beyond that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely vital, because when we look at the evidence, 0 to 2 is one of the most significant times for the growth of any human being. And it's that period where they're not quite getting into nursery. And I completely agree with what you're saying. I think it is an area that everybody needs to really think about, particularly when we've got these vaccination certificates now as evidence that people are able to develop these community groups. Yeah, and I think that's going to be essential for social mobility as well, investment. I mean, that's what Sure Start with education, education, education. David Blunkett was all about, wasn't it? And to see where we are now and where that was is harsh, really.
One very last thought. It was when you were talking earlier about Latin, Daniela. When I was in secondary school, the book that I first started studying Latin with was something called Ecce Romani.
Fantastic! You are very lucky. Eh?
I still think about my Latin teacher and the Ecce Romani series, and it's something now that when I thinking back on it, it reminds me of a very, very early reader that I can remember using, called Janet and John.
Yeah. You remember well.
Except it was in Latin.
Fantastic, Kathleen. You are very smart.
But Latin for me, and this is just a personal thing, was the root of absolutely everything else that I studied, all the languages that I studied. And going back, I really thought that there was a trick missed in dropping Latin from the curriculum, and it's now started to re-emerge. But people's understanding of their own language, in many cases, I'm not saying everyone, but in many cases, is supported in a very proven way by Latin. And it does strike me that it's a very strange subject not to have appeared more strongly in the curriculum. At this point, I will stop talking.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's very true that Latin is of mind. I would like to thank everyone for the exchange of ideas today, because it was very, very beautiful. Thanks, Alison, from what you explained to us. The project can be, I think, very useful for Africa. It's very, very important. And I think there is a true need for citizens with autonomy of thought, who seek the common good as a priority in their work. This is the fundamental priority. I think we are sure that today's meeting gave a clear picture of why this project is worth funding. And we are grateful to all those who want to collaborate in this bold goal, to contribute to the progress of Africa. And the pandemic, I think, has taught us that we cannot save ourselves. Each of us is responsible for the other, and we can take care of him or her in different ways. I think financing the project is a handy way, I think. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And it is important to note that this work is a way of finding proof of concept to underpin the bid with the international consortium for Horizon Europe funding. We're just waiting for the calls. That's where we really want to work. That's where our partners have been focusing energies, and that would help us to build capacity in the work in Africa as well, and in Asia. Mesa, do you have anything you'd like to add before we come to a close?
Well, actually, I really want to talk today, but I'm having the hay fever, so I'm just trying to hold back a little bit, because whenever I talk, I sneeze and cough a little bit and scare people around me. So, so when you cough now and sneeze, it's more like a committing offensive act. First of all, when I saw the link in the morning about the project of Africa, I was very excited, and I was very, very happy to see things coming into practice, you know, things that we've been talking about, and now potentially having the opportunity to do something about it. So thank you for this initiative, and thank you for this talk. It really explains how we're moving forward, and how we can, it's a platform for us, for people to hear us and to contribute to our cause. Sorry. So just leave it there and say thank you for all this contribution and for exchanging ideas, as Yella said. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for being here for this meeting, and thank you, Kathleen, as well, for coming and joining the panel. And let's onwards and upwards and continue to work for empowerment for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone as well, and on my side, I do hope your hay fever goes away soon.
Thank you.
So we'll bring the EYSIER SIG to a close, and I wish you all a very happy week, and we'll meet again in 2 weeks' time for our next meeting. Thank you and good night.
Night all.